Hello and welcome to this episode of the P&E podcast. My name's Jack Jacob and I am your host. In this episode, I'm joined by Arthur Charvonia, who's the Chief Executive at Babergh and Mid-Suffolk District Councils. This is another insightful episode really focused around leadership and the responsibility in local government. It was making a difference in people's lives that attracted Arthur firstly to law and then into local government. His career in law taught him invaluable skills for his career as a leader, advocating, presenting, negotiating, among others. As a leader, Arthur feels tremendous amount of responsibility to not only his staff, but every resident, business and visitor to his community. He's very much a people person who thoroughly enjoyed the camaraderie at boarding school and emphasises being a leader as a human, using common sense, trusting people enough to take their own advice at face value. Please do enjoy this episode as we get to know the person behind the job title. So, Arthur, you're a qualified barrister. So you've done a law degree at university, and now you're the chief executive of a joint council. How did that happen?
That's a long and convoluted story, but essentially, you're absolutely right. When I was at school, what I wanted to be was a barrister. Went down that route. Really enjoyed it. Still would enjoy that kind of work. But the nature of being a barrister and the nature of particularly doing legal aid work is not very conducive with having a family, and certainly not when you're a junior barrister. And so because I started a family relatively young, we took the decision that actually having some paid employment might be a good idea. So that led me to working for the police. And so for a while I was working in-house for the police as a lawyer, not doing criminal work, but doing their civil work. So things like shotgun licenses when people have been bad and they need to have them taken away from them, antisocial behaviour type work. Particularly there was a case, please don't Google it, of bringing out an ASBO against a herd of pigs in Norfolk, which I think found its way onto not...
Everyone listening to this is now going straight onto Google and going, pigs, ASBO, Norfolk.
Fortunately, although the story got mentioned on Have I Got News for You, I didn't, so that was good.
Oh, perfect.
I know, brilliant.
I'm sure they had a right laugh at that.
Absolutely. And then things like civil cases where the police would get sued, so unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, those kind of things. And so I was enjoying that, having a great time doing that for a long time. But what it was clear to me is it was a bit career limiting because there's only a limited number of police forces, there's only a limited amount of that kind of work. And so when the Licensing Act came along, with a change to the licensing laws where we're all going to sit outside and drink cafe style 24 hours a day, which of course is a bit of a joke at the moment with lockdown, but when that came along, I'd done a bit of licensing law as a barrister, and I so took the opportunity to hop across into local government because the laws meant that local government became responsible for that work rather than the magistrates' courts. And then I never really looked back. So from my perspective, local government isn't that different. It gives me what I need that I was getting as a barrister. So all those kind of skill sets of holding meetings, standing up in court, advocating, presenting, I do all that day in,
arguing,
day out.
Arguing well.
Exactly, arguing, absolutely. So do that all day in, day out. I just don't have the judge stood in front of me anymore from that perspective. So it's a bit of a sort of odd circuitous route, but I mean, I certainly would advocate for everybody saying, if you could in school do a mini program around advocacy, writing skills, conference skills and negotiation skills, they're all good, solid business skills. They would stand everybody in good stead for any job. And so I think that would be a really useful thing for the future, particularly as our economy looks slightly uncertain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I was thinking that with your background, you know, you'd probably be a pretty good salesman and like a pretty good kind of entrepreneur and kind of having those, you know, those kind of legal skills or that barrister skill. It's pretty diverse.
I'll whisper it quietly, but my brother's an estate agent, so yeah, maybe.
Well, if it all goes wrong in the council, at least you can tap your brother up and say, yeah, go on, give us a job.
Yeah, precisely.
So let's take it back a bit. So talk to me about your life growing up. So where are you from? Where'd you go to school? How did you do in school? That kind of thing.
So I grew up in North London, in Enfield, and I had a relatively privileged upbringing. So I didn't go to state school. I didn't suffer any hardship at all in that regard. I had a relatively easy life. Although I've got a brother, as I mentioned, he's a half brother, so I lived an only child in terms of growing up.
Yeah.
Then went to boarding school. So I was in boarding school from the age of 13, which I both hated for about 6 weeks and then absolutely loved thereafter.
Oh, really?
And yeah.
See, what is it? Just that shock to the system, but then you've got at a young age freedom that you wouldn't have in your kind of parents' household.
Yeah, I suppose you go from being the only child in the centre of your parents' eye, as it were, as living at home, to suddenly being in what at the time was a long dormitory with about 60 other boys, and all of which who are basically older than you, all of which who've got marked their own territory already. And yeah, that's quite intimidating when you're slightly homesick initially, and then trying to get used to your new surroundings. But the camaraderie that then comes from that afterwards builds really strong bonds, and I certainly wouldn't change that for the world.
Yeah, of course. So were you academic in your boarding school, or going to boarding school? Do you kind of have to be academic because there's no divide between your kind of school life and there is, of course, but your school life and your personal life. But in terms of like the punishment perspective, you're in the same building or the set of buildings, and so if you're not performing academically, I'm sure that making you go to detention or whatever the punishment would be is easier to enforce.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got no escape from that. It's not like you can duck out or something in the same way. You're not likely to run away, particularly the school I was in. It was in the middle of nowhere in the countryside. So you're not going to get very far. So there's certainly, I suppose, there's a degree of discipline instilled in it. I mean, it's not prison. It's not a miserable life at all. But it certainly means that there's a much more regimented way of life. So things like homework, much more straightforward, because all those temptations that you might have if you were at home, particularly these day and age, just weren't there because everyone is doing their homework at the same time. You're all sat down, somebody's supervising you, and so it does mean that just becomes much more of a routine.
Was that like an extended class almost?
Yeah, in some respects. And it just meant that it was supervised by other pupils. So it tend to be one of the sort of the older years, and they'd be doing their own homework at the same time. It's just they were responsible for making sure that everybody wasn't talking and wasn't mucking around, basically. But it's exactly that. It's that kind of more regimented style, and also some flexibility. So the way in which they'd work the timetable meant that during the summer, because it's daylight for longer, they'd rejig the lessons. So we'd have lessons later in the evening, and we'd do more sport during the day because it was using the daylight hours. And then again in the winter, they'd rejig it slightly again to make sure that you had the opportunities as far as possible. So it's just a very different way of life, really.
Yeah, of course. But one you ultimately enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, wouldn't change it for the world. And I'm very conscious of that's a privileged upbringing that I had that not everybody gets the opportunity to enjoy. It's not a pressure on me, but at the same time, I am conscious that that's not normal. That's not what everybody's experienced.
Of course. Do you think from that background then, because going to boarding school for your parents would cost a reasonable amount of money to send you away for that kind of private schooling. Did you find it hard to resonate with people that hadn't had that kind of upbringing early on in your career? And did you have to adapt as you kind of got into leadership roles where by pretty much the most part, probably 95% of the people that you would have led hadn't had that bringing?
I've never found it a problem. And I'm hoping other people have never found it a problem as well, because it's easy to see from my side of life and think, oh no, that's not an issue for anyone else. And I'm not entirely sure why. Certainly, I mean, the minute you go to university, you're thrown back into the melting pot. It's much more of a mix of life. I went to boarding school went to university in London, and so it's very diverse, both international and local. So, I've just never found it as an issue. I kind of, I suppose, should give an acknowledgement to my parents that they gave me the advantage of those experiences, but at the same time kept me very grounded in terms of not getting above my station and not feeling as though I am something better than anyone else, because that's certainly never been the case. And certainly in terms of my leadership style, which we might come on and talk about, I'm very values-based. I'm very conscious that part of the thing that attracts me to local government and keeps me in local government is being able to make a difference to people's lives. That was ultimately one of my frustrations why I left being at the bar, was because at the bar you can have an impact on people's lives, but it's a bit late. it's at the court door after things have gone wrong and you're trying to put them back together. Whereas in local government, you're much more upstream, and also you're supporting whole communities, not just one individual in one single case. But it's the same principles.
Sure. So on that note then, do you feel like you're responsible for not only the staff that work for you, but the population that fall within your joint councils?
Absolutely, yeah. So from my perspective, that responsibility absolutely extends to every resident and every business, and to some extent to every visitor as well into our patch. That they're citizens. They're ultimately paying for all of our wages. Our responsibility is to make sure that we're providing the best possible service that we can to all of them, and that is, yeah, absolutely, it's a personal responsibility, I feel, as chief executive, towards all of our residents, our citizens, our tenants, our customers. Pick a word in that regard, but particularly within that, to the most vulnerable. Lots of people are able to look after themselves. Most people's contact with councils is relatively small, and they don't necessarily want to have any contact with their council either. As long as the bin gets collected, as long as the street lights come on, as long as the roads are clean, they're pretty much happy with things. But others are not so fortunate in life, and particularly at the moment, coming out of the COVID situation, expecting to find many more people who are in need. And that's particularly where I think that the responsibility is on us as a councillor, me as chief executive, and the politicians, of course, as well, to be providing that safety net and support and leg up to the most vulnerable in our society. Sure.
Makes sense. Interesting journey then. So then from boarding school to uni, where you done law and uni. So boarding school was that secondary school age or primary school age all the way up to A levels?
Secondary school, so 13. Okay.
Yeah,
13 so GCSEs and A levels.
Yeah, A levels. Okay, cool. Interesting. And so then you went. So you done your law degree and then worked as a barrister. How long did you work as a barrister for?
Probably about a couple of years in total, including the pupillage period. So you have to do the first 9 months of pupillage, which is essentially following somebody around. In the first period of time, you can't do any cases. You're literally just bag carrying and learning.
You're just shadowing, basically, learning the trade.
Yeah, exactly. Just learning the trade. You'll be doing some drafting behind the scenes, so your pupil master will get you doing things on their behalf, but you're not stood up in court. You're not advocating. You're not on your own. And then for the second half of that, then you're allowed out on your own into the wider world, and we'll be doing some of that work. So I was about a couple of years, because as I said before, we got married relatively young, and my wife was very clear we were not going to. I was 24, and my wife was very clear that as far as she was concerned, we were not going to have a family in London. We were going to go back to where her family comes from, which is Norfolk. So that's what drew me to East Anglia in the first place.
Makes sense. Wife always wins, the real boss, eh?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So talk to me. So the first time, like, you had to stand up in court and speak, was that like a scary moment?
It was a really scary moment, yeah. Because as much as you can be confident in, you've done your preparation, you know what you want to say, you've got the sort of twin elements of, you don't know what your opposite number is going to say, so the barrister on the other side. And I think there's always a perception that you're enemies in some way. That's probably down to television and how that's portrayed, but you're not at all. You're all part of the same trade. You get on very well, but equally you don't know how good they are, so you don't know what arguments they're going to put forward. And then I think the bigger fear factor for me was always the judge, always the person on the other side who clearly is going to know more than me, because I've only just started doing it, and not making a fool of yourself. And at the same time, recognizing you've got a responsibility to your clients. So I did a lot of family work in the first phases, and as well as little bits of crime, but particularly the family work. These were people's lives. Usually they've gone through a family breakdown. They're trying to sort out their contact arrangements with their children. You certainly feel a clear sense of responsibility to not screw that up.
I bet you never forget your first case.
No, absolutely not.
No. Interesting. So barrister wanted to move out of London to raise family. So did you move out of London after you'd had your first child, or before?
No, later. So we moved out before. Yeah, so we moved out before and then had children later. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we were.
I think I asked that question in the weirdest way.
So we knew that we wanted to start a family relatively young. The idea being that we were still sort of youngish parents when they started to get older. So my oldest is now 18, which is frightening. And so that was why we made the move at that stage.
Yeah. And you wanted to have kids young, and that's kind of. So you got 3 children, right?
Got 3 children. Yes, so I've got an 18-year-old, a 15-year-old, and in next week a 12-year-old.
Boys, girls?
Mixture, boy in the middle, poor sod, surrounded by 2 girls.
Yeah. Well, I've got 3 girls, so I'm the poor sod that's surrounded by 4 women in the house.
Yeah, no, you win.
Yeah. Dog. Got the dog. Had to call it Jackson because that was the only chance I had of having any kind of man company in the house. But yeah, no, interesting. Okay, cool. So then you went. So from there, that's when you then got the job at Norfolk Constabulary, was it then?
Yeah, that's right. So and at the time, and it sounds horrible, but it was just a job. It was any job. So it was a case of just trying to find something that was relevant to obviously the background and the education that I'd had and the training. But at the same time, it just happened to be Norfolk Constabulary. It could have easily have been somebody else if it had been a different set of circumstances.
Yeah, makes sense. So when so you're in a pretty high leadership role, in the local authority space, in terms of job title, the highest you can get. Obviously, there's bigger councils you could go to and so on. But was you a natural leader growing up? Was you a natural? Because you don't become a chief executive of any organization by accident. There's values that you need to have. There's ways that you need to hold yourself. Was that something that was always in you, do you think?
I think it was a degree of it was always in there without me knowing, but most of it is learned. It's learned behaviour and practice. So, it sounds like an odd thing to say for a barrister. I used to hate public speaking. I really, really hate it and avoid it at all costs, particularly as a child at school. The last thing I certainly wouldn't be the one putting my hand up and trying to answer questions. I'd let other people do that because I just had that fear of doing it. But you, like anything, I think it's just you practice, and you force yourself to face your fears in that sense. And after a while, you become much more confident with it and more comfortable with it. And it's the same with management. So I found myself in local government, my second job effectively in local government as a head of service. And I'd never had any management training at all. And I was very fortunate that they sent me on some training, which was just part of routine. It wasn't specifically for me. But I was very conscious from that about understanding what I didn't know. So people around me who'd done MBAs, who knew all these different models of management and leadership styles, and I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. And you do need a degree of, I suppose, confidence to be able to say, yeah, but I do know which way is up. I do know how to have a conversation and a sensible discussion. And if I don't know something, I'll ask. And be able to learn that way. And so I've always been inquisitive. So it's always helped in terms of wanting to better myself, wanting to improve myself. But it was a long time before I actually had responsibility for managing people. And even then, I hadn't been taught how to do it. It was something I just had to draw upon from a little bit of experience in sort of personal life. Used to play rugby, was part of teams who sort of management in that regard. But largely it was drawing upon experience of other managers I'd had in the past, good experiences, bad experiences. Do I want to be like that? Do I not want to be like that? What did I learn from that experience? What I wouldn't do again in that way?
So do you think part of being a leader is being really self-reflective and being accountable to yourself on kind of your bad points, really? Because your good points you can harvest and so on, but your bad points are the ones that you really need to tackle head on, aren't they?
So, certainly for me, that's what I do as leadership, and there's not one way of doing it. But for me, it is absolutely that. It's being acutely self-aware, and it's looking for that feedback. And you have to actively seek it out. And particularly the more senior you get, people become even more shy about telling you things. So it becomes harder in some respects. You have to force people to say, look, I want to know. I'm also brutally straightforward, I suppose, with my staff in particular, in terms of saying, look, I am not the perfect chief executive. I won't ever be the perfect chief executive because there's no such thing. But I will do is keep trying to get better at it. And that's all I ask of you in all of your jobs as well, that you keep trying to get better at it. And we do that through communication. We do that through learning, not basically bearing a grudge, as it were, but saying, okay, what went well there, what went better, or what could have gone better rather. And trying to reinforce and remind ourselves about that next time round.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, for me, for my business, I went from a position where I was just a senior sales guy into owning and running a business, and I'd never managed a team before. So it's, interesting that, excusing naivety, but not and right now, but until not long ago, I didn't even realize there was management methodologies or principles or textbooks to saying you should handle this situation in this way and so on. But at the same time, I don't even know if I'd want to learn leadership from a textbook.
No, definitely not.
Yeah,
and I'd agree with you in terms of, I was exactly the same. I didn't know that stuff existed. I knew I wanted to be a barrister. I knew the route to becoming a barrister. I knew, roughly speaking, what a barrister did. And there's no management involved in that. You've got a clerk to look after your caseload. Your clerk takes care of your finances. You might have an accountant if you're lucky enough in due course. But otherwise, there was no management skills or models or theories or any of that. I didn't know it existed even. And even now, although I find that stuff interesting, I'm not one of these people who can pick up a book and absorb it and read it from cover to cover. I'd find that too frustrating. I'm interested in it in terms of, I want to delve into it and I'll challenge it. So I won't accept it necessarily as being, yeah, absolutely, that's the thing that resonates with me and that's the style I'm going to be. For me, it's about picking and choosing. It's taking elements that you find from different sources. And the real sort of, not so much eye-opener, but the thing that works much more effectively for me as a time short and lazy person in that regard is things like YouTube. So YouTube can give you snippets of these things in a much more effective way. And then if I'm more interested, then I'll go and buy the book and I might delve in a bit further detail.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think that, it's leadership's about common sense ultimately. It's about showing empathy, it's about showing integrity, it's about doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, but also having to make tough calls, and it might be the wrong thing for that person, but it's the right thing for the overarching vision or for the company or for whatever it might be, right? And I think that, it's a lot of emotional intelligence, and how do you learn emotional intelligence from a book? But at the same time, for example, here you go, book that I'm reading at the minute, Bob Iger from the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. It's called Lessons in Creative Leadership. So here I am reading a book on. So don't get me wrong. I'm not anti these kind of books or these kind of, because I find them incredibly interesting. But what I am pleased with is that I didn't start there. Because if I started there, my style would probably have been molded by that rather than that molding my style, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. Yeah. I agree entirely. And I think the best leaders I've come across, they're all diverse. They've all had different backgrounds and they've all learned and evolved along the way. They've not started from the perspective of, I want to be a leader. I'd be worried about that kind of person.
Yeah,
something slightly worrying there.
It's almost fake, isn't it? It's like, how can you? It's almost like a facade that's put on, and then because it's not genuine and real, then it's not. Then it's then perceived as not genuine and real, and then the credibility goes, and then the whole kind of losing the team happens very quickly. Because I've worked for organizations like that, and I've worked for people that have got promotions and very quickly failed and gone back to being a salesperson again. And because it is difficult, it really is difficult.
I was certainly very fortunate, I think, which was the first local government that I worked in properly, which was Waveney District Council in Suffolk. I didn't know at the time when I took the job, but they were a basket case as an organisation. They were performing really poorly. And during my time there, that became clear. And it meant that there was more opportunities. I think if I'd have gone in an organisation that was performing really, really well, I don't think I'd have been able to progress as far as I have. And I don't think I'd have learned as much. Yeah, I learned a lot more from the mistakes that the organisation and people within it were making at the time than I ever would from something that's high flying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what does leadership mean to you then?
I suppose for me, it's about being very human. As you said, about common sense. It doesn't mean it's easy, doesn't mean it's straightforward, but it is about leadership in that moment. So sometimes that is about making relatively quick decisions on short amounts of evidence or short amounts of information, or taking people's advice at face value and without the time to necessarily dig into it to be able to investigate. And of course, as a lawyer, that feels really uncomfortable, or could feel really uncomfortable, because I'm used to evidence and
Yeah,
detail.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that was one of the things I had to get more comfortable with, was being able to recognize that sometimes it's more important to make a decision then and there than to cogitate over it for a week and then make what you might think is a better decision, but actually wasn't, because the important thing was a decision was made in the moment. But equally, it's that judgment as to when is that inappropriate, because it's easy to snap judge things and using instinct, when actually something needs a bit more time, it needs a bit more consideration, and it needs a bit more engagement. So for me, that balance, one of the biggest challenges, finding that balance between being chief executive, if you like, I'm in charge, I make the decisions, which isn't my style at all, versus very, very democratic as a management team. But it also can feel quite woolly, quite fluffy, if you like, and feel as though you're not actually getting anywhere. You're just engaging lots of people without necessarily reaching a decision. I think a lot of the time it's judging that balance as to, depending on the issue, depending on the circumstances, but people have to feel engaged. They have to feel as though they own the things we're dealing with. And if I'm telling them what to do all the time, they're not learning, but also they're not going to feel as though they own it. They're not going to be empowered. So I'm very much of the opinion that we should be working always towards an organization that feels though it knows the framework, it understands in broad terms where we're trying to get to, it understands the vision, as it were, it understands our values, and has the autonomy to make its own decisions, and also the permission to make mistakes. So right from I started this job, I've said to our staff, I want you to make mistakes. Not just I'll back you if you make a mistake. I actively want you to make mistakes, because if you're not, we're not stretching ourselves, we're not learning, we're not doing the best we can for our communities and our residents. But even now, I can probably count on one hand when they've actually made mistakes, because me telling them they're allowed to make mistakes and them feeling as though they're actually allowed to make mistakes is a much bigger journey and a bigger challenge to get them to that point where they genuinely feel confident enough to try stuff, in the knowledge that trying stuff is how we learn.
Yeah, makes sense. So how do you approach difficult conversations then? Because you lead with common sense, you lead with empathy, you lead with, as you said, with your human side. How do you deal with, or how do you make those difficult conversations?
I think what I've found in the past is that sometimes I've done them, if you like, too well. And that sounds arrogant. I don't mean it that way. I mean too well as in they haven't worked. Because again, probably drawing upon my background, I suppose, I can present something and have a conversation with in a way that the person comes away feeling good about themselves. And you want them to do that. Whatever that difficult conversation is, you don't want them to feel as though they've just completely deflated them. You want them to come away feeling positive. Exactly. That's not my management or leadership style. But of course, if you do that too well, they miss the point. They don't see the issue that you're actually raising. They come away feeling empowered, which is great, but actually they've not learned the lesson that you wanted them to learn along the way. So I've certainly made mistakes in that regard, in trying to sugarcoat in a positive way for all the right reasons things, because I lean in that direction. I'm more empathetic rather than just do it. I mean, you won't hear me shout and scream around the office ever. I think the only time I ever have shouted is probably at the kids, but that's about all. They're the only ones who know how to push my buttons. So I lean on that side of the empathetic, which doesn't mean it's harder to do difficult decisions and harder to do difficult conversations. Actually, it's easier, but I do have to focus quite hard on making sure the persons really understand the point that whatever the issue is, we're trying to get through to them.
Yeah, makes sense. So, does that change though from say colleagues to say counsellors to members of the public? Does that have to change depending on who you're talking with?
Always, and not just between those differentiations, but even within those categories, if you like. So my style with one member of staff will not be the same with another member of staff. Same, my style with a counsellor won't be the same with another counsellor. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the biggest challenge, is doing those in circumstances where you don't know the person. Walking into a room, which I've done several times with community groups, where you're not talking on a one-to-one basis, you're talking en masse, and you don't know any of them, or you might know a few of them, but not the sort of general view. That's the hardest skill, because it's trying to find a way of getting through to those people in a way that they all can appreciate, or they can all, because we all learn differently. We've all got different learning styles. We've all different communication styles. And we have a room where people want to rant. They need to get that out of the system. They want to have a go, and fine, let them have a go. I certainly remember one in particular where the people I was talking to were saying, it's all about them. And I had to try and get under the skin of who he meant by them. And as I started to unpick it, them, the council. And I wasn't chief exec at the time, but I was in a director role. And I said, well, do you mean me? No. Well, do you mean my boss? No. Well, who do you mean then? Because who do you think this thing is that is the council? Because I can guarantee you now, all my staff want to do a fantastic job for you day in, day out. None of them are working against you. They work in the public sector because it aligns with their values. They could all be earning probably much more money in the private sector, but they've chosen to work in the public sector because it's part of who they are. It's in their DNA, in the most part. So they're all trying to do the right thing, and that trying to get that across to people is a real challenge, because there's one of the difficulties with the councils in particular and local government is we don't tend to have a brand. We're seen as that bureaucratic, faceless thing. And certainly where I work, there are 3 tiers of local government. So you've got the parish council or the town council, us as the district council, and then the county council. So it's really confusing for the public as to, well, which bit are you? Whereas often I talk about the NHS and the police. Well, NHS is a vast, complicated, enormous thing, and yet everybody knows what they do. We're a much more local, purely exist to serve your local purposes, and nobody knows what we do, apart from collect the bins.
Yeah, collect the bins and make sure potholes aren't there.
Exactly. So part of it, So part of our challenge is really getting through to our residents about what we're here for and our values, and that's leadership to my mind. That's part and parcel of what we're there for. Because if we can build those bridges and build that relationship with our communities, then we can be more effective in terms of what we can do for them, but particularly with them, not so much for them. So that's a real emphasis for me, is around our value basis and building a bit of a brand, and in that wider sense.
Yeah, sure. So you've mentioned your values a lot, right? And values for me are, I just find it, I find it quite difficult to really kind of understand. I understand from a perspective of what my true values are, and that's integrity and empathy and so on and so forth. But to really nail down that and say why, I think it's something that perhaps takes time to get to. So first of all, what are your values and why are they your values?
Yeah, I think you're right. That I've been through a journey with this in terms of, is it just motherhood and apple pie and just nonsense and management mumbo jumbo, if you like, or is it something that's real? And I think the turning point for me was the emphasis on, and it was a sales point, is really that people buy stuff because of why you do it rather than necessarily what you do. So take a bad example. We've all got choice around what cars we buy. We don't buy logically. We buy based upon a whole variety of things. It might be what's the flashiest, it might be what's the fastest, it might be to some degree what we can afford. But oftentimes we're buying into a brand, buying into a value basis of, I want to be that type of person, or I want to be that type of person that drives that type of car or owns that kind of phone or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what it is for the organization as well. It's so a mixture. So I've got a hyper efficient, if you like, boring Ford car, which is just about getting me to the office and back. And I'm firmly of the view, following lockdown, that I've seen if I can get rid of it, because I don't think I'll need to go into the office as much anymore.
Yeah.
And then my wife drives the Jag, which is a completely different end of the spectrum.
One extreme to the other. Yeah.
Exactly.
There you go. So go on. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're fine. It's a good point. So for me, in terms of the organisational values, it's trying to focus away from, or build on rather than we're the public sector, we work in the public sector, and aren't we great, as it were, because we work in the public sector? No, that's not the issue. It's why. What is it really intrinsically that makes us who we are? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Why do we work in that way? And for me, that always comes back to communities. That always comes back to supporting the most vulnerable and communities. And yes, they can add to that. You can be in terms of our approach around customers, yes, around empathy and support and all those other things. But quite often it comes down to that impact we're trying to have on our place and on our communities and on our residents, which isn't necessarily my values. So when I talk about values, I don't mean my personal values. I mean the organizational values, because I don't think you can get to a situation whereby I tell you as my employee that your values should align to the council's. No, you've got your own. You've all got your own value basis that changes over time as well. It evolves over time. Certainly mine's massively changed since I had kids. That has a fundamental effect on your life. And I no doubt other things will at different points in time as well. I learned the most, I suppose, when I did a coaching course, and that really opened my eyes to emotional intelligence, connecting, active listening, and trying to find ways of building rapport, which is about trying to understand the person and as I get under their skin, and then you start talking about understanding their values as well.
Sure. So when you say coaching program, was that like a 2-day getaway, or was that like a mentor type program?
It was I think it was a ILM thing. So it was a specific program with a view to, over a course of 5 days, spread out over about 6 months, developing me as a coach. The idea being that you can do one-to-one coaching, but actually where I've found it most useful is actually in just general leadership day to day. So it's not so much the sitting down and coaching that person in front of me, albeit I can do that. It's more the how do you bring the coaching skill set to the wider organisation.
Yeah, sure. Makes sense. So has that helped you develop other leaders? Because I think that's one key thing that leaders need to show, is that they can build other leaders.
I think it's part of what's helped with that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the biggest things I've struggled with, particularly as chief executive, because you want to build a strong team around you. But you also I want people who can outgrow us, recognize that actually I haven't got the role for you anymore. You're better than what I can offer you. What you need to now do is go off elsewhere and grow further. And if I'm lucky, you might come back again at a later date. But I'm not going to hold it against you. I want you to grow. So certainly in local government, there was in the past, there was a tradition of you would go into local government at YTS stage and you'd stay your whole career and you would never leave. And you can see why that would happen, because actually local government opens up huge opportunities, because you can jump around, you can move departments, there's local government everywhere, so you haven't necessarily got to stay in the same part of the country even. But there was a degree of stageness, if you like, or danger of that by people staying put almost for too long. Whereas I'm very much from the perspective, I'd rather get the best of you and really have the best of you for 2 years, and at that end of that 2 years you leave, and I've trained you and I've nurtured you and I've developed you, and that's annoying because you want to keep that person for longer, but you recognise that that's the best thing for them.
Yeah.
And also there's new bloods that brings other people into the organisation.
Yeah, because you've had that recently, haven't you, where one of your senior leadership team moved over as the chief executive of London Borough?
Yeah, Brentwood. Yeah. In Essex.
Okay.
Yeah, last December. Yeah, last December he moved across, and exactly that. He'd been with us for I think nearly 2 years on the dot. And great for him. And actually I take personal pride in that.
I was going to say, are you proud of that?
A small part, absolutely, hugely proud of that. And I wouldn't be arrogant enough to say, well, you got that job because of me, because that won't be the case at all. It will be a build up a whole load of things. But at the same time, I'm very proud of the fact that somebody who immediately from us went on to become chief exec somewhere else. That's great.
Yeah, of course. So your chief exec role that you're in now, that was your first chief executive role, wasn't it?
Yeah,
how did you feel when you got there?
It was a weird one, because I'd been wanting to become a chief exec for quite a long time, and I'd put my hat in the ring for several jobs. In fact, actually, I'd applied for this role that I now have when it had been previously advertised, about 5 years previously, maybe a bit less, maybe about 3 years previously, and I wasn't ready at the time, and I probably didn't know that, but I do know with hindsight that I definitely wasn't ready at the time. And it's daunting. I think the biggest daunting thing was not so much the step up from being a director to chief exec, because I'd had enough time to think about that and really think about how I was going to make my mark, what kind of chief exec I wanted to be. And I'd learned along the way that there's no one type of chief exec. So certainly in the past, I'd worked for a chief executive who was great, but he was the wrong chief executive for that organisation at that point in time. So he had a really collegiate approach. That was the council I mentioned earlier. But that council was in such a mess that wasn't what it needed. It needed a different approach at that point in time. And that taught me a lesson I just assumed as a naive Yeah, it just needed more of a stick at the time, and more force,
Okay.
and shorter time periods. It needed to take a much more definitive, we're going to change this, it's going to be a short, sharp shock to the organisation, rather than a more of an arm around the shoulder and a slower burn. There wasn't the time for that, and that wasn't the right style for the organisation. It needed shaking up more. And that taught me, because as a sort of a junior local government officer, I just assumed that when you become a chief exec, and as kind of all chief execs are this wonderful beasts that know all the answers and they're all the same and they could all be chief execs anywhere. It's not like that. It's the right leader in the right place at the right time. So I was very conscious of thinking about that for my organisations now, as to how that should work.
So so that was your first chief executive role, and you'd kind of gone through a place where the timing was right. Basically, you'd gone from previously applying for more than one.
Yeah, for probably about 5, I suppose, in the end. And I had a really good piece of advice from somebody along the way, which was not to be disheartened, because up until that point, I'd been lucky enough that most of the time I'd apply for a job, I'd be the best candidate, and I'd get the job. And so I wasn't used to being rejected in that way. And so it did come as quite a demotivating thing. I did start thinking to myself, well, am I right to be a chief executive? Is it me? Am I doing things wrong? And somebody gave me some fantastic advice, which was simply to say, no, look, from everything we're seeing, and this was somebody on the interview panel, you absolutely need to keep applying. And when it's the right time, when it's the right place, you'll get the job. But you can't determine who you're up against in that moment, what the other person is going to say, the people that you're competing with. And it comes down to quite fine margins. And so, yeah, just keep at it, essentially. So I did.
Yeah, no, good for you. Good for you. So was there like an influential person in your life, either professionally or personally, that either harvested you or mentored you, or someone that was just massively inspiring for you?
I don't think there was a single person. I mean, of the sort of, I was picking somebody out, is my most recent boss, so the chief executive of East Suffolk, as it now is, just because I worked with him for such a period of time, and through that difficult time for that organisation, and so his influence, I learned a huge amount from him, and still do, because obviously he's part of the same Suffolk network, so we still meet each other, and so we still have the opportunity in that regard. Beyond that, no, I don't think there was a sort of inspirational single figure or sort of hero type worship type thing. No, I think it was more elements of lots of different people that picked up along the way, both positive and negative. And again, a bit like anything, I probably learned more from the people I don't want to be like than I have from the people that I do want to be like. And it's just distilling that, and again having the bravery to hold the mirror up to yourself and saying, am I slipping? Am I still being true to myself? Am I displaying some of those characteristics that I really didn't like myself? Am I in danger of bleeding into that type of person, or am I being true to myself and being able to hold firm and continue to grow and learn?
Sure. You're very self-reflective. Do you have set time to do that, or do you do it once every month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, or is it just that ongoing come on Arthur, you're being an arse, or come on Arthur, you're doing really well?
I suppose the advantage of being chief exec is that loads of people do it for me. And they're usually the people who aren't backwards and coming forward as well. So, and there's a balance there, because of course the people who will speak the loudest are the ones who are usually making negative points. Not always, but they will be prepared to do that. So the minute I stand up and expose myself in front of councillors and staff in terms of saying, right, I'm going to do a presentation, it's that time of the year, chief exec's on tour, then inevitably that gives you feedback, which is fantastic. That's what I thrive off, and really need. I still struggle to get it and get it in a timely way. I think that's the even more key aspect, because there's no point me self-reflecting over the last 12 months and thinking, oh, I really shouldn't have done that 8 months ago. It's too late. So for me, it's about trying to get that reflection in the moment. My kids keep me very grounded as well. I mean, they still haven't got a clue what it is I do for a living, and are very clear at pointing that out and looking incredulous, as it were, and as best I try and explain it, they still don't understand. So it keeps you very normal.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, how would you describe your day-to-day role? Because I don't think I could describe my I don't know how I would describe my day-to-day role.
I think the the default description is probably the most unhelpful, which is speaking to lots of people in lots of meetings, dealing with lots of emails. But that doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't describe what it is. And I can go to the other end of the spectrum and start talking sort of grand words about trying to change this area and we're trying to have an impact and trying to affect people's lives. And of course, that's too broad as well. That doesn't mean anything. And then the default is the one in the middle, which is to describe the services we deliver as an organisation. But to me, that absolutely misses the point. The fact we do building control, well, so what? I mean, that's important. I'm not diminishing building control officers, but at the same time, that really isn't the essence of what we're trying to achieve. So it's one of those things that I think always requires a longer conversation, and also to explain the politics. Because the closest I can give, particularly for those in the private sector, is to say, well, you know that board you've got, if that's the structure you've probably got, let's say 6, 8 people on your board. I've got 66. So that's the way I try and explain. Now that's not true either. That's an exaggeration, but that's the way I try and explain the politics. The fact that there are effectively 66 stakeholders as councillors who are all very different people. And again, the management of them is just as important as the management of the staff and the leadership of them. And that's a shared relationship because, again, you're in charge of your own business. You're in charge. There's no one else. I'm chief executive of 2 councils, but I'm not the only one in charge. I've got 2 leaders for a start. So it's a very different dynamic, different relationship between the chief executive and the political leadership of the organisation as well.
Yeah, sure. What about politics in not the sense of politics, but just kind of red tape politics, and you know, whether that slows innovation, whether that causes problems to be quick and responsive to issues or whatever it might be. You know, is there anything you change about the sector that you work within?
Yeah, there are certainly things where the challenge is
but you're not going to go
that.
on record with them.
No, I wouldn't. No, I probably would actually. The COVID, it's interesting with COVID-19 and our response to that has been a private example where we've just had to respond. We've done stuff, and I've done stuff, and then asked for forgiveness, if you like, afterwards from the politicians because there hasn't been the time to take it through the normal processes. But I think it's horses for courses. It depends on what it is. Where I would like to see all politicians, not just mine, is much more focused on the big picture, much more focused on the legacy they want to leave for their places. What's the thing that they want to be able to point to their grandchildren and say, look, I achieved that. That's the difference I made as the local politician in this place. Whereas often that's not necessarily the reason they come into politics. More often than not, people are coming to politics because of planning. And they want to have an impact on planning decisions, which is much more granular in many respects. And they can't help themselves, and I don't blame them for that, but they want to get involved in detail. And so they'll get involved in how many parking meters have you got over there and who's done what, as it were. And that's fine, but that's the bit where the line is for me, which is let me worry about that stuff. Don't get involved in that stuff as a politician. Be aware of it and trust me, have trust in me that I'll tell you if you need to know, as it were. But really what I want you focused on is what do you want to achieve with the fact that we own 7,000 council houses? What's the impact you want to have with that? And what's the right number of council houses? Do you believe in social housing in a way that means that you want us to double the number of council houses? Or do you want us to drive forward on a different agenda around the economy and the high street? So there's much bigger things. And so the challenge on that front is working with the politicians to reach consensus, because they all come from different backgrounds, not just politically. So they fall into different political parties, of course they do, but even within one political party doesn't mean they will agree with each other. Quite often they don't agree with each other. So it's trying to build a picture of what is it you want to achieve for your places and getting them to focus on those places and those communities, and then build some consensus, and then we know where we need to go to, as it were.
Yeah, sure. Let's change the questioning away from work for a minute. Talk to me about your family, because you mentioned before that your wife didn't necessarily want you to be a barrister because of the long hours, because of the the kind of intrusive nature in your personal life that role holds. You're now in a role that is probably exactly the same as that. Long hours. You go to work with work on your mind. You come home with work on your mind, no doubt. So how's that and kind of developed and over your career?
Yeah, naive, wasn't I? Um, interesting. It was a joint decision. So it wasn't so much my wife in that regard, because she also trained as a barrister. So she knew where she was coming from, as it were, in that regard. But it was more what we wanted from family life, and where we wanted that balance between work life and family life. And I get it wrong, absolutely. And I think everybody gets it wrong in that regard. And again, lockdown has been a real eye opener in some respects, but not necessarily better. So I no longer have a commute. That's fantastic. I started from an early point of the lockdown of faking my commute. So taking the dog out first thing, just to have that break between being at home and at work, which of course you haven't got, but you've got that sort of artificial divide. And even now, I know I'm getting it wrong, because what we've seen, certainly as an organisation, is old habits starting to bleed into home working environment. So tomorrow, for example, we've got a meeting of all the chief executives in Suffolk. It's starting at 8 a.m. It never would have started at 8 a.m. previously. It would have started at 9 o'clock. But of course, it can start at 8 now because nobody's commuting, so it is. And I think that's where we're getting it wrong, because we need to protect ourselves and protect our time to think. That's the main thing. So I used to do the commute is not just a break between work and home. It's also the sort of decompression chamber from being at work and coming home again. But it's also a critical time to think and catch up on what else is going on in the world. It seems a ridiculous thing, but I'm much less aware of the news now than I was when I was going into work, because that was the time when I would catch up with what was going on with the world, the hour on the way there and the hour on the way back. Whereas now I'm just straight into work and then straight out of work. So it's a difficult blend, and you change over time in terms of what your family needs and how old the children are, and what their balance and support and the kind of hobbies that they have, and therefore how that takes up time on your space, as it were.
AKA Dad's taxi service.
Yeah, to some degree. I have to say it was hugely liberating once my eldest became 17 and drives her own car. That really helpful. Not least because she could take the other two to school.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome. So, you still work long hours though as part of your role, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you do to unwind and relax and be Arthur for Arthur's sake, not Arthur for being the chief executive of the council?
Yeah, I suppose I've always found it relatively easy just to stop. And that's luck. That's nothing I've done. That's no special technique. There's nothing in that regard.
So has it taken you time to get to that point though?
No. Yeah, throughout, even in other roles in the past, I've always found it very easy to flick the switch and simply say, no, I'm now in home mode, or now I'm in work mode. I don't find that difficulty switching off. Having said that, I suspect if you were asked my wife the same question, she'd say the complete opposite, which is she would say, I never switch off. And there is a bit of truth in that as well. So one of my ways of being able to manage that balance is I only have a work phone. I don't have a home mobile. I just have a work mobile. And that's a dangerous thing, because it means that I'm always in connection with the emails. But it also enables me to manage my time, so I can see quite easily, okay, that stuff's happening. I don't need to be involved in that. I can step outside of that. Others are dealing with those things. It's 5 o'clock on a Friday. I don't need to be dealing with those things. And I've always had, I think, quite a mature approach, which is, it doesn't matter how much work you've got to get done today. If I finish it at midnight, it's not going to make any difference to anyone else's life. So if I pick it up tomorrow morning, it's just the same. So let's leave it till tomorrow morning. Occasionally that's not the case. Occasionally you need to be into something immediately, but most of the time stuff can wait. And the thing I try and nurture with all of the staff, and particularly the senior leaders within the management team, is you are more in control of your own time than you think you are. There's very little in your day as a senior leader, and particularly as chief executive. If I don't want to do something, I don't do it. If I do want to do something, I do it. And there's very little that I have to go to. So if there's a full council meeting, yes, I have to be there. I mean, even then I could probably make an argument for not being there, but my view is I have to be there. But most of the time, everything else in my diary is at my gift. And I think that's also true of the rest of us as well. And we don't realize it. We get stuck in the rhythm of the PA has put that in my diary, or somebody else has asked for a meeting, and you can very easily lose control of those things. But if you're in control of that, that also means you can control the home stuff quite easily as well.
So do you have a point where you say, right, enough's enough, this is the time I stop?
Not as a sort of a point in the evening or anything like that. No, I don't have a sort of routine. So I will finish at a different time every day, just depending upon what I'm doing, whether I feel still in the mood and whether or not it's critically important or whether it can wait. And that,
do you
I
work
think
when
the
you get
biggest
home
challenge
from
is,
work?
no, not normally, and that again, the home working environment has become very different. So I won't. We work from Surface Pros, so I wouldn't switch on the Surface Pro when I get home from work if I'd been going into the office. No, I'd work on the phone if there were emails to respond to, or if I needed to look at things or felt I wanted to look at things. But I wouldn't be opening up and doing sort of major work from home. So I've got colleagues, one of my directors, who on a Sunday afternoon, because it suits her lifestyle, her husband goes away to work on a Sunday because he works away during the week. And so I will receive a barrage, if you like, of emails from her on a Sunday afternoon because she chooses to work at that point in time. And I won't criticize her for that because that's what works for her. I don't. So the weekend, I don't do that. Others feel they need to or want to, and that's fine. I'm not going to not have a problem. And the approach we adopted as a council a long time ago now is very agile. So I don't really care how many hours you work. What I care about is what you produce during that work, the outcomes. Absolutely. We've not quite been brave enough yet, although I have scared a few people occasionally, of saying maybe we should do away with annual leave. Because if we were true to what I just described, you wouldn't have a preset amount of annual leave that you could qualify for each year and then use up. You would simply say, well, if I've got no time to do it because I've got work to do, then I can't take annual leave. If I've got all these things done and I feel able to take annual leave, I can take annual leave. And if you're getting your work done, if you're producing your outcomes and you're hyper efficient, and that means you get more annual leave that year, should I really care about it? And
Do you think that would work?
But as I say, we haven't been brave enough.
Yeah. Well, do you think that would work on low-level staff? And I don't mean that in but people that aren't
No, you're right.
in a senior leadership role.
I think it's not so much the senior leadership versus other roles, although there is a bit of that. You're absolutely right. I think it's more a case of the role itself. So what I just described doesn't work if your job is to answer the phone calls as a customer services assistant, because I need you to work from certain time of the morning to a certain time of the evening and be available accordingly because those are our opening hours. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It won't work for the whole organisation, and that's the nature of local government as well. We're so diverse in terms of the different functions. It does mean that one of the challenges is balancing what's fair, because often what people mean by fair is they mean the same. So they would want to be treated exactly the same way in one department to another department. Whereas my view is no, that isn't fair because you're not doing the same role. And we've taken that approach at Christmas, for example. So we stay open at Christmas now. We used to close. My view is that Christmas can be a horrible time for residents, for normal human beings. Lives break down at Christmas. Yes, it can be wonderful, but it can also be miserable. And therefore, the idea that we as an organisation that's supposed to be there to support the most vulnerable are closed at one of those pinnacle times seems ridiculous. So we stay open. But we're then flexible in the sense of saying to, for example, our elections teams, normally, last year being the exception to the rule, we don't have elections in December. And so it makes no sense that I'm forcing you to come to the office and do work when this is the least busy time of your year. Take leave, take time off, you don't need to be in. But if you work in homelessness, yeah, you need to be in because we're likely to get more demand. And some might argue that's not fair. I would argue, no, that's reflective of the fact that at the end of the day, we've got a job to do. And we rightly should be held accountable to our customers, to our residents, not just to ourselves. And so we need to be keeping that at the forefront of our mind all the time.
Sure. So hobbies and interests, things like that, you know, so you mentioned you played rugby before. Are you into any other sports? Have you got like a love for anything?
Rugby and golf, I suppose, are the two, and neither of them ever get me out doing them anymore. So they've fallen by the wayside through family life. So I'm kind of hopeful that they'll come back around again, but probably the golf rather than the rugby. But those are the two main ones that have occupied my time, particularly when I was younger, and then following through. More often than not, because of the long hours that you talked about. Actually, I'm quite happy just spending time at home with the kids. I don't need to have and with my wife as well, rather than having a hobby as such. Just doing things with them is fine. That's become more difficult just because the older they get, they don't want to spend time with their dad. They want to be doing their own thing, or they want to be plugged into the Xbox. So yeah, that becomes a different challenge.
Of course. Yeah, I something has to give, right? You can't. So for me, like my mates, the majority have moved out of their family home in the last year or so. The majority still go down the pub, well, when it was open most Fridays, or at least at some point at the weekend.
Yeah.
And I think they struggle to understand that why I maybe only do that once every couple of months. It's not even once a month anymore. And it's because something has to give. You can't do it all. You cannot be senior within your or you can't have a demanding job, regardless of whether it's a senior position or not. You can't have such a demanding job and have a family and socialize like you used to. It's just, there's not enough time, but there's also not enough mental capacity to do it.
Yeah.
And it's also very unfair on my children, because I'm young, but I've got 3 children, right? So if I go to the pub and get pissed on a Friday night, it's not fair to them on the Saturday that I'm then not at home Monday to Friday, really, again, out of COVID time, really, before, I'm gone around when they wake up and back around when they go to bed. If I'm then hungover all day on a Saturday, when do they see their dad? I think people really struggle, especially I think people at perhaps a younger age struggle with that don't have children, and that I'm notoriously late all the time, but I can blame the kids now because I got them, but
you couldn't before.
Yeah, I couldn't before, but it is demanding, and life is demanding when you're in positions.
You have to prioritize. Yeah, you have to prioritize, and you make decisions as to what you think's best. And again, a bit like work, you'll get it wrong, but it doesn't matter, because it's, as long as your decision and you own it, it's fine. Because you're right, you can't do anything. That's why I don't play much golf at all, is because I can't justify the 4 hours in terms of family time. Because if I'm taking a day off work, then that's a day's annual leave that my priority is to spend with the family, not to spend on the golf course on my own, or not on my own, but not with them, as it were. Particularly that length of time. So yeah, it's trying to balance everything up in our lives, which I suppose we're all trying to do it throughout our lives at different points.
So difficult, isn't it? So difficult. I want to cover COVID just briefly before I kind of get on to the last question. What impact has COVID had on kind of your day-to-day role, but also what impact has it had on the organization in terms of transformation and becoming almost the opposite of what public sector organizations seen as, and that's very slow, you're not very reactive, and you've had to become the complete opposite. You've had to act at pace, make decisions quickly, implement technologies quickly, perhaps without the huge and in some cases unneeded extensive due diligence that typically goes on. So COVID as a whole, day-to-day role and transformation wise, what's it mean?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, COVID is tragic, and just to say that at the outset, the death toll and the impact on society, nobody would wish that at all. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. It has provided a huge amount of opportunity. I mean, I'm struck. I think it was Disney Plus who launched in March, and are already talking about the fact that from their business perspective, they're at the E07 level that they would hope to have reached in a matter of 3 months. And of course, that's luck. They didn't know COVID was going to come along. I hope they didn't. And so they were very fortunate in terms of their timing. But it just shows you that you can be in the right place at the right time and need to respond. And I suppose, just to sort of slightly disagree with what you said earlier, local government and the public sector generally has always been fantastic in a crisis. So our ability to mobilise when there's an emergency, it's always just happened. It doesn't just happen by accident. It happens because of a lot of rehearsal and a lot of planning that goes into it. But we've always been good at that. What we've seen with this in particular is, though, it's not a normal emergency. So a normal emergency, we might get flooding. It's there. The waters subside. We support those families. But broadly speaking, the world goes back to normal, if you like. And you might have some longer term flooding programs to try and prevent it from happening next time. But essentially, you go back to how you're doing things before. This isn't that. at all. And particularly in emergency planning terms, you normally go from emergency response, and then there's quite a clear distinction line where you move from the emergency response into your recovery phase. Again, we haven't got that with this. This is going to be back and forth from emergency to recovery throughout, and it's going to keep bouncing around, I think, as we go through over time, and it's just going to last a lot longer, inevitably last a lot longer, and isn't something we've been able to plan for, because it is that partnership between local government and central government. So the whole localized track and trace that's now come in, nobody had ever planned for that, I don't think. Certainly if they had, we hadn't done that at a local level. We're having to reinvent something, or invent something rather, but we're not inventing it just for the next 2 weeks. We're inventing something that's going to be with us bluntly until we've got a vaccine. So let's say 18 months potentially, if not a lot longer. So it's all very new, and as a result, you're absolutely right. What I can see, and what not just me but what my staff are saying to me, is please can we hang on to the dynamic culture that has had to come out of that, because you're right, for all the right reasons. In the past we might have spent months doing due diligence on a piece of software, working out whether it's the right thing to do. We do that because ultimately it's public money, you're held to account for it if you get it wrong, and it comes back to my point about being prepared and brave enough to make mistakes. But it also demonstrates that you can just do stuff, make it work, and it's fine. And so, yeah, what we are now looking at as an organisation is where are those opportunities. So you'll be familiar, but for other people's benefit, we moved offices 2.5 years ago. And the reason we moved offices is because of working for two organisations. We had two headquarters buildings. It made no sense at all. So the council, before I joined, both councils made the decision to say, right, we're going to move out of our two headquarters buildings. That's totally inefficient, and we're going to move into a single headquarters. But because of the politics and because of some other reasons, they couldn't decide where they were going to put it. And so ultimately, we've ended up sharing offices with the county council. So we lease a floor of the county council's building, but it's outside of our two districts. So I think other than one other council, but I think we're the only districts in the country that are actually based outside of their districts, which is a challenge for us when you're trying to deal with emergencies. Not on the ground, it's not a challenge in that sense, but psychologically feeling part of the community, it's a mini barrier. But what that meant was, more significantly, and the reason why we did all of that was because we adopted much more agile processes then. So the way in which we work and the IT support that we've got behind us means that having to work from home, so the offices are closed. My intention is to keep them closed at this point in time, because they don't need to reopen. And even if they were to reopen, with the amount of social distancing type provisions we put in place, they'd probably only be able to house probably a quarter of the actual capacity. But everybody who has a home-based type activity, that kind of work, clearly bin men don't work from home, but other type of jobs, they are functioning just as effectively, if not more effectively, than they did before. And they're dealing with all the other nonsense, or not nonsense, but challenges that have come with COVID. So they're having to deal with the fact that until recently their kids are at home, and they've suddenly become teachers as well as parents and as well as employees, and they're looking after their older relatives, and I suspect some of them have gone through family breakdowns as well as a result of all of this. And so despite all of that, we're still delivering the services in a productive way. And so my glass half full approach would say, well, if you took away all of those things from a COVID perspective, just think how much more productive we could be if you didn't have all that other stuff going on at the same time. Think what we could really achieve then. And equally, I don't want to miss the opportunity, because if we go back into the offices, we're not, but if we went back in the offices tomorrow, I know what human behaviour is like. We'd slip back into old habits fairly quickly. And so we would miss the window of opportunity to say, actually, we can change this. So we're now looking at, well, what is it to have an office? What do we mean by an office? Why do we need a headquarters? What does an office? What does a council need that building for? It's not so you've got some columns and a sign of prestige. Surely it's not that. I mean, ours wasn't that anyway, but it's not that kind of thing. So what is it for? And the conclusions we're beginning to reach is, well, I don't need an office for a meeting, because I can do that from home. I don't need an office to work on my emails and things like that. The desk, as it were, I can do that from home. What can't we do from home? And when I say from home, actually, I mean anywhere. So what we don't want to develop is a bunch of home workers. What we want to develop is a bunch of people who can work wherever they need to, whenever they need to. But if we need office space, then to me, it's collaboration space, it's creative space, it's the kind of stuff that you can't quite do as effectively. Yeah, you can bring up a whiteboard on a Teams page, but it's not the same. And so for us, it's a case of saying, okay, how many of those spaces do we need, and who is it we need to be collaborating with? So logically, where would you put that? Because that's not just internal collaboration, that's with other partners as well. And so we're starting to tease out all of those kind of thoughts, and that also links into what more do we want to do in terms of technology. And let's not think too far ahead, because certainly some of my colleagues were saying, well, let's have a 10-year vision. You can't. I've got no idea what the technology is going to look like in 10 years. We didn't know we'd be doing this 10 months ago. So let's not try and set false targets, as it were.
Do you know what I struggle with?
We do need windows.
Yeah, of course. I struggle with, they could go, well, what's the 3-year plan? What's the 5-year plan with your business, blah, blah. My mind doesn't work that way. I'll 2 years is probably in what I've got mental capacity wise to forecast and deal with and so on. Now, don't get me wrong. Yes, there's a long-term vision. Yes, there is an overarching thing that we as a business, me personally, would like to achieve. But to say that that's a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan is almost just stupid, because it's all right. What's the next pandemic that comes along? Or, do we find out that, or is there going to be a world war that goes on? Do you know what I mean? It's just, there's so many variables to a period of 60 months or 120 months that you can't forecast that time.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
The thing for me is not so much having exactly as you say, not having a sort of a false time frame to it. It's more a case of, if we're at step A, and normally you would, to get to step C, you'd go via step B. Can we skip step B? Are there things we can do? Can we at least think ourselves outside, to use that expression, outside of the box enough to see whether or not we can predict just one step ahead rather than 10 steps ahead? Because we can't do 10 steps ahead, but can we miss a step? And I'd use the office accommodation example. So when our counsellors, and as I say, I wasn't there, but when they were having the discussion about, do we need to move offices, I'm prepared to bet, although if I'm wrong, I'm prepared to pay them out, but I'm prepared to bet that none of them said, we don't need an office. And yet now, because of COVID, some of them are prepared to have that kind of conversation to say, we don't need an office. We don't need a place to meet. We don't need these things in that same way. We can work in our communities. And so the reason they're doing that is because their framing has changed. What the art of the possible has changed. And so that's the bit I want us to try and think of is, okay, can we just remove some of those artificial barriers in terms of our thinking, almost get back to a blank sheet of paper, but also just think one step ahead? Because if we can do that, I think that's the best you can ask for.
Yeah, no, definitely. Cool. All right. Well, look, let's is your nickname Charvy by any chance?
It's not mine. So it was my dad's. And my grandfather used to run a tailoring company called Charvy. So I've got a sort of ream of labels that would go in the inside of a suit with Charvy. And I've kind of appropriated it from him because as you'd expect as a person with ginger hair, my nicknames all revolved around that. So I've just moved myself away from that one.
Yeah. Well, no, I was looking. I see your Twitter name is HRV. Your Instagram name is HRV.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's why I asked. Right. Last question. Bit of a left field one, and one that's going to put you on the spot a little bit, just to see how
we've been cut off.
Pardon?
I said, we've been cut off.
Yeah. I bet. Literally, there we go. Look,
I took that out, didn't I?
There we go. Look, then you turn your computer off, you turn your camera off. It's going to hang up now. So right. It's a hypothetical situation.
Yes.
2 years from now, you've left the council, and you are now the chairman of a global consumer product company. Okay. Bit of a weird setup. This, it wouldn't happen in real life, but hypothetical situation.
I'm going with it. Yeah.
You've got to assemble. You've had a board walk out on you, and you've got to assemble your last 3 members of your board. So you've got to choose a chief executive, a chief marketing officer, and a chief commercial officer. The premise of it is that you've got a product that could potentially change the world. It's almost like you've got the iPhone of this time, right? But like I said, you need to assemble the correct board. Now you can choose anyone, celebrities, entrepreneurs, people you've worked with previously, dead or alive. So in history, but who do you choose as your chief executive and why? Who do you choose as your marketing or chief marketing officer and why? And who do you choose as your chief commercial officer and why?
Oh, that's a challenge. Specific individuals, or can I talk more broadly?
Specific individuals.
Yeah.
But like I said, it doesn't have to be people you've previously worked with. It can be anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think in terms of the commercial one, it would be a previous chief finance officer that I've worked with, only because he was the most maverick chief finance officer that I can think of, because he knew the numbers, and that was the important thing, but he also knew not to be tied by the numbers, and was prepared to think very, very laterally and very liberally, if you like, in terms of the numbers. Not break the rules, but at the same time know where they are and know how to bend them, and be able to think outside of the sort of normal parameters that you might otherwise have from a commercial perspective. Marketing's hard, because I haven't worked with a huge number of marketing officers. One of the challenges of local government is that we don't normally spend time in that marketing space, and I think we should. It's one of the areas that, when I talk about branding, I think we should spend much more time in that space. I suppose I'd be looking for, again, somebody with a really strong behavioural science approach. So I've forgotten his name, and it'll come back to me, which is terrible. But there's a gentleman who I've certainly read some of the literature of and watched. Rory Sutherland. There you go. And I think he would be fantastic in that space, because very much focused on human behaviour. What is it you're trying to market, and why? And what is it that you're selling? Because, to use your example, you're not selling an iPhone. You're selling a way of life, or you're selling something other than an iPhone. I think at the moment you only have to look at all the iPhone adverts, all the phone adverts. They're selling cameras. They're not selling phones anymore. So absolutely, that somebody with a really deep-rooted sense of behavioural science underpinning the approach to marketing, because of, as we said before, about emotional intelligence and human behaviour really underpinning what you're trying to do. The chief executive one's probably the hardest. I can't pick me, can I? that would be cheating.
Yeah, that would be. You're the chairman, so you can't be chief executive as well.
Well, occasionally it happens, and I always think that's wrong.
Oh yeah, it's true. It does. I think Mark Zuckerberg's the chairman of Facebook and the CEO, isn't he?
Yeah, and I'm never quite, as you'd expect, the legal background, I'm never quite sure from a governance perspective whether that's a good idea.
Yeah.
It feels to me as though that's a decidedly bad idea.
It basically means that he cannot get sacked, doesn't it, really?
Yes, yeah, precisely, yes. Or he can, but it was his own fault, absolutely.
Yeah.
Did it to himself. So now the chief exec one, I'm struggling with, because I think I'd need to know much more about the business and much more about the point in time and what it is you're trying to achieve, because it goes back to what I was saying earlier, and I know I'm cheating, but it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of the right chief executive for that moment, and what you're trying to develop. Certainly what I'd want in terms of personality is somebody who would push both the organisation, but particularly me as chairman. I would want somebody who's going to really make, not life difficult for the sake of making life difficult, but really make you think, provide those opportunities, but also particularly lead the organisation. Ultimately, that's what it boils down to, and that visible leadership, in particular of whatever that business is in that regard.
Makes sense. There we go. Well, you didn't give me a name, but you gave me an answer, so that is good enough.
The mark of a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there we go. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Arthur. It has been
right. Thank you.
A pleasure to get to know the person behind the job title.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for listening to that episode of the P&E podcast. If you like what you heard, please make sure that you share this episode via your social media channels, as it really does help us to gain traction in promoting this podcast series. Please make sure that you also subscribe to the channel that you're listening via, as you'll then get notifications as soon as we release our next podcast episode. Thank you.